Welcome to Cult Connections. Let's see what we are taking a sideways look at today.
Hello everybody and welcome back to Cult Connections. As always, I'm your host Ian. My guest today, he's the teacher, he is an author. You can also find him probably having frequent their baths in some dark, lonely water. It is Mr. Leon Hunt. How are you, Leon?
Hello, thank you.
Are you well, sir?
I am well.
Good. So, like I said, the reason for you coming on there today, Leon, and we're going to talk about certainly the director that I've had a lot of fun actually sort of researching there sort of recently, and always a lot of fun actually watching his films. But that is Mario Bava. But you have the book out about the man himself. So, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, actually, strictly speaking, I guess I've actually kind of done two books on Bava now, because prior to this one, I did a monograph on one of his films, which is actually one of the ones we're going to talk about today, Danger Diabolic. So I did a sort of little monograph on that, and that partly sort of led me on to wanting to write a longer book about Bava. Now, because I'm aware that there are some very good books on Bava already, I wanted to find a different approach to writing about him. So what I've kind of not done in the book is, I suppose, the obvious approach of like you start with Black Sunday or whatever, or wherever you want to start, and you sort of go through to Shock or wherever you want to stop. So how I've approached Bava in the book is to sort of organise it more around different ways of approaching Bava. So genre would be an obvious example. Bava is often seen as a kind of pioneer of the Italian horror film, one of the pioneering figures. He's obviously seen as an important figure in relation to the Giallo. His thrillers from the 60s are seen as formative in the Italian Giallo. I wanted to look more closely at the style of his films. You know, one of the things that I think has held people's interest in Bava over the years is the way they look. And often, you know, the look of the films makes up for maybe some other things where they're not quite so strong. You know, people will sometimes talk about, you know, maybe the plot isn't the most thrilling thing about the film. The acting isn't the most thrilling thing about the film, but they look so gorgeous and they're so atmospheric. So I wanted to kind of dig into that a little bit. You know, what are the characteristics of the Bava style? And I think his style changed kind of over the years as well, as he was, you know, working in different kinds of production setups. And I was also interested in Bava's reputation, because he has this standing where, obviously, for fans of Italian horror, and I think horror fans more generally, cult film fans, fans of Italian genre cinema, he's this major figure. And, you know, in terms of Italian horror, probably pretty much stands alongside Dario Argento, even though Argento is, you know, much more famous, much more successful, much more popular filmmaker, but they're sort of seen as the twin titans of Italian horror, if you like. But we're often told, you know, Bava was obscure. He didn't have critical recognition. So I wanted to also kind of trace, well, what has happened to his reputation over the years? What did people think of the films when they first came out? Was he as neglected in Italy as it sometimes sounds as though he was? Did French critics love him as much as it sometimes sounds as though they did? You know, how have we arrived at, you know, the funny thing about Bava is the way that he's a hugely celebrated figure, but a marginal figure at the same time. You know, there are still many people who've never heard of it.
Yeah, I think that's such a fascinating angle as well, because certainly for me and as a horror fan, and if you think the sort of Italian horror, I mean, you know, and you've already touched on this there, Leon. I mean, the Bava springs to mind almost first and foremost. You know, Bava, the Argento, they're Fulci as well. I mean, for me, like they're the big sort of three, as it were, of horror, certainly. But I think you're right. It's an interesting one about he's certainly they're revered in sort of horror circles, and and you can, and to this day, you can find his films as well. I mean, I think that's a big
Yeah.
one, is you can actually watch them.
Yeah, which
Yeah.
wasn't always the case. I mean, I can remember Bava was a filmmaker I knew about and had heard about several years before I saw any of the films,
Hmm.
because when I was growing up, they weren't initially easy to see. They weren't being shown on TV. They certainly, where I lived, and I suspect I mean, I live in London now, but I didn't when I was growing up. I suspect you could find them in repertory cinemas in London, but
Hmm.
they weren't easy films to see. But I can remember reading about them and reading about Black Sunday and thinking, they just sounded extraordinary. You'd see the stills of Barbara Steele and images of Boris Karloff in Black Sabbath, and really wanting to see them. And yet, as you say, we're in a situation now where they're so easy to see, and most of them in on Blu-ray. It's not. I mean, they started to be a little bit easier to see when they were coming out on VHS. Some
Hmm.
of them came out on VHS. Then more of them came out on DVD, and now you have box sets and also the releases where you sort of get to see the different versions of Barber films. I think that's the other fascinating thing, was not just being able to see them, but which version do you get to see?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's amazing as well. I mean, like you say, I mean, most of their Italian, genre films, certainly from the 60s and their 70s, have about five different their sort of titles.
Yeah,
Three different dubs. If you can watch something in with their their titles on it, then that's a bonus there sometimes, or you have to deal with say a 1970s sort of dub, or a partial dub sometimes, and
yeah,
yeah, it's a fascinating world, and I think it does very much sort of inform how you view a film as well, and when you see them in such they're sort of different sort of versions as well. You can
yeah. Yeah, I mean, some of the films, their reputation improved as better versions of them became available. I mean, I suppose the obvious example is Lisa and the Devil. For many many years, Lisa and the Devil was not available in its original version,
mhm.
and people had to sort of try and discern what Lisa and the Devil might have looked like from House of Exorcism,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
which actually does have quite a lot of Lisa and the Devil in it. I think you could get a sense of the film from that, but
Uh-huh.
obviously with lots of vomiting and swearing added to it as well, of which there isn't very much in the original film.
No. And again, it's it's amazing sort of subworld as well of their Italian, their cinema, uh, when the not the film their makers, but their studios, they themselves went to such lengths to actually market a film, or like you say there, to chop it up into something that feels very, very different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's the extreme case where a film just really becomes a completely different film.
I all
It's not even like a different version, it's just a different film.
Yeah, but I think as well, though. I mean, obviously, Fred Barford, and you know, for yourself, Leon, you are looking at, well, how can I talk about a filmmaker that obviously you really love so much, in a slightly different angle. And he is certainly spoken about a lot these days. We are aware of there is a lot of writing, and podcasts and all kinds of things, talking
Yeah.
about his work. But they do focus on his horror films a lot, and quite rightly so, because it's such a popular sort of genre. But I think as well, one thing that maybe gets a little bit lost with sort of Bava, and he did fairly much come out of the traps working in sort of horror and the giallo as well. So in the sort of thriller type of films, but like so many the directors at that time, he's got much more sort of diverse their sort of canon as well. I mean,
Yeah,
there's
I
so
mean,
many different sort of genres, isn't there?
there's a period. I mean, his official debut is Black Sunday or La Maschera del Demonio, the original title. And then really it's 3 years before he makes another straight horror film. In
Hmm.
63, he did Black Sabbath and Whip and the Body. But in between, I mean, he does his first Giallo, but also he was still dabbling in the peplum. The peplum was
Hmm.
still sort of running on into the early 60s. And the peplum is certainly at that point as important to Bava as the horror film is. Bava was
Uh-huh.
one of the major figures in the peplum, even though he maybe didn't sort of, he wasn't maybe the solo director on very many, but certainly as a cinematographer, and he was, doing. I mean, of course, Bava the fixer coming in and sorting out problem films. He's run out of money, and Bava turns up with his sheets of glass and pictures on, and manages to sort of create a set for the film, or the director walks off the film. Um, he was doing a lot of stuff on the peplum, and I think that the way that the peplum took off as an international commercial success story with the Hercules films, a lot of that was down to Bava, because even though he was the DP on the first two Hercules films that Pietro Francisci directed, Bava's cinematography and his effects were really important to making those films, frankly, look much more expensive than they had any right to.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And we are going there to start with that. So we are going to talk about Hercules in the Haunted World, also known as Hercules in the Center of the Earth,
Yes.
which has got nothing to do with James the Mason. There, by the way, there's
No.
no, thankfully, but like I say, it's an interesting genre, isn't it? The peplum. I mean, it's there were so many of them made, very, very, very popular at the time, and dare I say it, possibly influenced their sort of Hollywood as well, in their making some of their big sort of sword and their sandal films. Um,
Yeah. And also, I think an influence on things like Jason and the Argonauts.
yeah,
That sort of is around the same time as well. And it's the first Italian popular genre that really took off internationally. I mean, it paved the way for all the ones that followed on. The Italian Western, the horror film, the giallo, the poliziotteschi of the 70s. The peplum is kind of the first of those, really, because Hercules, even though in some ways it's sort of, I think it remains a bit of a mystery. Much as I love the film, it remains a bit of a mystery why that first Hercules film took off internationally in quite the way that it did.
uh-huh.
I mean, it got picked up by Joseph E. Levine for American distribution, and they sort of did this big ad campaign for it. And it was, I mean, the production company behind it, Galatea, were really sort of, I mean, I think it kind of was for them. I think Hercules was for them what Curse of Frankenstein was for Hammer in some ways. It's like, okay, we found something that we can kind of push now.
Yeah,
And
uh-huh.
then they sort of make the sequel, which was apparently the biggest box office film in the UK the year that it came out. And yet, strangely, they've sort of faded a little bit in public consciousness. They've never quite taken on the sort of the cult appeal that the horror films do.
Hmm.
Probably
Yeah.
because they're not violent enough.
Uh,
I think the more the sort of the gorier and the more extreme ones have a sort of better chance of getting people's attention. And the peplum still has that. It still has that image of being it's of being very camp, basically.
yeah.
It's like referenced in the Rocky Horror Show, Steve Reeves and so on. That
That's,
they're sort of camp
yeah.
kitschy.
Uh-huh. It's an interesting, and it, but within the peplum itself, and what I find is that there is an interesting range of their films within it. Almost
Yeah,
like certain sub sort of genres as well. So, um,
and they
obviously,
were starting to tap into horror in '61 because the nice thing about this one and why it's one of the few peplum films to go onto Blu-ray, which is partly, of course, because it's a Bava film, but also because you can also watch it as a horror film.
yeah,
It's a
yeah,
peplum, but it's also a vampire film, and it's got Christopher Lee, playing a kind of Greek Dracula, essentially, I guess.
and there's some quite. I'm not going to say that it's a hugely scary film or a particularly sort of terrifying film, but it's got a lovely sort of atmosphere and quite sort of dark and a bit sort of sinister, like you say, in their places as well, isn't it? So
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I'm genuinely surprised that when it was released in the UK, it got a U certificate.
yeah,
Because although, as you say, it's not Black Sunday, it's not Blood and Black Lace. I can imagine it. It generated a few nightmares in sort of if small children were taken to see it on a double bill with something.
yeah,
All
definitely,
those kind of corpses coming out of their graves and Christopher Lee reflected in a pool of blood.
yeah.
I am slightly surprised they got away with the use of it.
um, I you do actually wonder how much of the board actually really looked at the film at the time.
Yeah, I think there were some unusual decisions they made
Yeah,
sometimes. At the same time that they, refused a certificate to Black Sunday for about 7 or 8 years. They wouldn't initially pass it, and then eventually passed it. And John Trevelyan mentions it in his autobiography that, oh, we thought it was too violent and sadistic. And then 7 years later, we just thought it was a bit silly and no one was going to take it seriously. And you think, yeah, didn't stop you from cutting it, though, did it? Yeah, when it eventually came out.
um, and what would you say about this one? It is so obviously it is based in their sort of myths they themselves. So obviously Hercules, and so for this one he has to journey uh, into the Hades or the underworld to they retrieve the stone which will help free his their love, as it were. So, but I mean, something I was very much sort of struck by sort of Leon as regards the plot, and this is something that fans of almost any kind of their Italian film have to, as a hurdle that you have to get over. I think is that plot wise don't look too much for sort of logic or for things to
No,
make their sense, or because it just doesn't work like that, does it?
no, it doesn't. And actually, this is probably one of the better constructed ones. But even so, you're not really there for the plot. And it's interesting how often the plot doesn't particularly stay with you with these films. It's not all you tend to remember them for individual parts.
Hmm.
When you think about this film, you probably think of Christopher Lee reflected in the pool of blood. You think of all the whatever they are coming out of their tombs.
Yeah,
There's the sort of the fight with Hercules and Lico at the end. There's all that, and maybe the stuff with the Sybil and all of Bava's lighting.
yeah,
But the plot is often a bit murkier. And often you just notice, there'll be about 5 or 6 writers credited, And you get the sense that they didn't always talk to each other very much. Somebody has a go at it, and someone else adds
Yeah.
another sort of little bit. And this sort of pick and mix approach to, you take a bit of the original mythology and put it in, but it also feels a little bit as though there are some bits of Black Sunday that have gone into it. The idea of the cursed family, the fact that the reason why Liko wants to drink Deianira's blood is not it's not the sort of the conventional vampire, blood as sustenance. It's because he wants to kind of, that's how he will sort of gain his power because he's her uncle or something,
Yeah.
which is very similar to kind of Arza and Katya in Black Sunday. She can only sort of restore all of her power once she's drained the life force from her descendant. And something kind of similar seems to be going on in this film.
And quite, like we say, quite sort of dark films for something that would be. I mean, this is the kind of film that I would possibly expect might have been shown on a Saturday morning or like a Saturday sort of matinee at your local flea pit.
Yeah.
I certainly I would have remembered if this had been shown at mine, but I wouldn't have been surprised if it had either. To be honest, that they do very much have that sort of feel about them.
Yeah, and you could sort of, you could mix in bits of, swashbuckling. Some of them seem to have bits of science fiction in them. They were just like all-purpose sort of, historical adventure films, really.
Yeah, I think what I was sort of struck by, and we have sort of touched on it, but sort of visually, now you can kind of tell that there's not a huge budget for these films.
Yeah.
But so many sequences do look really, really good.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, yes, you talk about sort of the limited resources. You sort of have to start to look out for the same pillars that turn up again and again in different locations. Quick, move them over to that set. But all the kind of, I mean, the Underworld, I think, is absolutely stunning. The sort of all the, sort of bubbling lava and Bava's signature lighting and the sort of the reds and greens and blues, the Garden of the Hesperides, and then you have something, really quite charmingly silly like Procrustes, who looks like he's sort of, could be in an episode of The Mighty Boosh or something like that. It's kind of lumbering kind of stone creature. But it's a type of cinema, and this is, I think, why Bava was so in demand for films during this period was, it was a type of cinema that was punching way above its weight. They always looked much better than they had any right to, because he could make them just look, if not $1 million, then certainly a lot more than they cost.
I think something that always struck me, and not just for Bava, but for so many of his their sort of their temporaries as well at this time, is that there was a real sort of production line about the films. I mean, the filmmakers were making three films a year.
Yeah. I think that's one of the reasons why Bava sort of flew under the radar a little bit of film critics, because these were part of a flood, an absolute flood of films, and also if you sort of look at some of the UK trade magazines, and you start to get a picture of how these films would have been seen when they first came out. It's like, oh God, yet another Hercules film. Yet another Italian Gothic film with Barbara Steele in, or something like that. And often it's, when you're living through a cycle, you can be a bit more. Often that leads to impatience with things that you're seeing over and over again. And then at a historical distance, those conventions and those repeated things, they can become part of the fascination. They become part of the thing that you think, okay, actually, that's not exactly the same as that. They tweaked it a little bit. They've done something slightly different with it.
I think as well for me, it is the quality of them, because there is a lot of high sort of quality films being
Yeah,
made in a very short space of their time, and
yeah.
I always find that they're sort of amazing how they manage to keep that up.
Yeah, and I think that Bava was, in terms of the look of his films, there's a period from, I think, from 1960 to 64, where he has an incredible run of consistency. And the films all look really good. The budgets vary a little bit, although I think they got a bit more than some of his later films did. He
Hmm.
got a consistent team around him. His camera operator, Ubaldo Tazzano, Franco Prosperi, his assistant director, Mario Serrandre, the editor who went on to much bigger things, was sort of editing Visconti films and so on. And Bava was obviously still enjoying all the stuff he was doing with his sort of his coloured gels and the lighting, and really all the films from that period, including this one. Blood and Black Lace comes from that period. The
Hmm.
Whip and the Body comes from that period. That they just all look fantastic.
Yeah. Um, I do have to mention their cast itself, or just a little bit for this one. Um, no one's going to win any acting their sort of awards on
No,
this film, definitely. Um, Reg Park though is good fun, and I can see why Arnold their Schwarzenegger hold him in such high regard, because he is ripped.
oh yeah, yeah. I mean, he of all the Peplum stars, I mean, Reg Park, Steve Reeves, and Gordon Scott really stand above all of the others.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Gordon Scott was the best actor of the three, but what he lacked in acting ability, I think Reg Park did have screen presence.
Yeah, definitely.
He looks really good on the screen.
Yeah.
Actually, in terms of acting, I think he gives a better performance in the Hercules film he did before this, which is Hercules Conquers Atlantis, where he's sort of maybe he's given a bit more to do in that film. And there's this
Yeah.
sort of nice sense of Hercules as this sort of rather easygoing and even slightly lazy character. He's
Uh-huh.
enormously strong, but he'll only do stuff when he absolutely has to. Whereas here he's more, he's the strong, powerful
Yeah.
presence, because I think Bava is maybe a bit more interested in the spooky stuff that's sort of
Yeah.
going on around the underworld.
Yeah. I will say, a great actor like the Christopher Lee doesn't really have to do much in this one.
No, but I suppose at that point, even some of the Hammer films he was doing during that period weren't yet always using that. I mean, some of the earlier Hammer films were using him more as an imposing physical presence,
Yeah.
and even, of course, in Curse of Frankenstein and the Mummy, not even giving him anything to say.
No.
He's the tall, heavy. And of course, I suppose the other thing that stands out here is that it isn't his own voice in
Yeah.
any of
Uh-huh.
the versions
Yeah.
of the film. It was a few years on before he managed to. I think he had it written into his contract that he could do his own English dubbing, but it's not his voice even in the English version. It's not
Think
his voice in Whip and the Body either.
no, and I do believe reading about that for the whip and the body is that it was afterwards. I think and he saw the film
Yeah,
and he went, I should have stayed for the dubbing.
yeah.
Yeah. He
Yeah, I
actually
mean, it's
regretted
funny.
that.
All the sort of the Christopher Lee's European films from that period, including there's the German Sherlock Holmes film he did that
Hmm.
Terence Fisher directed, where Sherlock Holmes is dubbed with an American accent again because they
Yeah.
didn't get Christopher Lee back to do it.
But I think he did. I think he watched it, realised it was such a good film, and was like, I should have had my voice on it. But
Yeah, I think
yeah,
he liked Mario Bava. He liked working with Mario Bava,
yeah,
and I think he thought highly of the Whip and the Body
yeah.
in particular.
But a good fun film, this one certainly. And if you don't know the Peplums, but you do know Bava, I would say this is a good way to, maybe just feel your way into that.
Yeah, I think it's understandably people are maybe not otherwise that enthusiastic about the sort of the mythological films, but I think because this also has a lot of sort of gothic horror in it, as you
Yeah,
say, it's a good sort of you might enjoy this one even if you're not otherwise particularly into the
yeah.
genre.
I must admit, I did. Yeah, I think you're right. These sort of gothic elements as well, like the vines with they they with the blood inside them and lovely stuff. Yeah,
Yeah,
very good. Yeah.
this is what we like to see.
So they absolutely their testament there to their Bava himself. Now, our next film there, Leon, which is such a fun film, and I've watched this film a good few times over the years, but actually coming back to it recently, and it's made me think about it even more. Um, but we're going to talk about again one that sort of stands alone in sort of Bava's their sort of catalogue, as it were. And this is a comic book adaptation, so very much something very, very sort of different. But we are talking the 1968, the Danger, the Diabolic, and this is just an amazingly fun film, isn't it?
It's great. It's great fun. This was actually the first Bava film I ever saw,
Uh huh.
which strangely did get shown on TV. BBC put it on one night in the early '80s, and that was the first time I'd seen it.
Hmm.
And first time I saw it, I really didn't know quite what to make of it because it's I associated Bava with horror films, and here you get this sort of comic book pop art movie, very much in the style that comic book movies tended to be made in the '60s. It's tongue in
Hmm.
cheek. It's got a sort of pop art feel to it. It's got a higher budget than some of the other Bava films because it was a Dino De Laurentiis production. Um, and Bava didn't particularly enjoy working for Dino De Laurentiis because he was used to. Bava was used to producers who, as long as he was sort of putting the right commercial elements in, I think he was allowed to pretty much do what he wanted.
Yeah.
De Laurentiis was a very hands-on producer. Very much saw himself as part of the creative team, and I think that was not something that Bava particularly liked. One thing De Laurentiis liked about Bava though was that I think he used less than half the budget.
Well, yeah. Now I'd read this one, and I was like, and I'm sure that the figures aren't quite right for a start. So,
Mm-hmm.
I'd read that apparently the Laurentiis had given the film a budget of $3 million. Now, for a start, I was like, that's far too high. I
Yeah,
can't imagine
yeah,
that
I
was the
think it
case.
might have been sort of slightly exact. I mean, I think it's probably almost certainly true that Barber brought it in massively under budget
Yeah,
because I
yeah,
just think
yeah.
he always, he would have much rather create. I mean, obviously, the scene we're talking about is Diabolic's hideout, this sort of
Yeah,
extraordinary underground hideout, which does look like, it's almost like the kind of thing that Ken Adam might have designed for one of the Bond films.
yeah,
And I think it was just, it was Barber's, because I always think there's that side to Barber that he's a guy who sort of, because there was like a kind of family workshop that Bava, his father, who also was a filmmaker and cinematographer, and they'd sort of play around with cameras and create special effects. And I always think there's a side to Bava as like a guy who likes building things in his shed, So, for a film like that, it's like, well, shall we build you a huge James Bond-like set? No need, no need. I'll get a few sheets of glass,
Yeah.
put it in front of my camera. It'll look fantastic, which of course it does.
Yeah.
I mean, it just looks absolutely astounding, that sequence.
Yeah, it absolutely does. I mean, I was actually just watching it just earlier there today. I stuck it on, and like you say, like the sequence where they are driving to his underground, lair. It looks absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think as well for me now one of the things now I went and watched the Batman there the other week there, Leon, and one of the things I'm always sort of struck by is that and what film fans always say about their Batman films is that they're waiting there for the perfect Batman, or there's always or so and so doesn't get the tone of their Batman right, or it doesn't work. And this film, in a way, reminds me of Adam West's Batman.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But what I'm thinking about, so if 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 the '66 Batman is camp Batman, then this film is the Kinky Batman. I think is
Yeah,
probably
yes.
the best way to describe it.
Yeah, I mean, it was made by the same two production companies who did Barbarella, and it was made pretty much back to back with Barbarella. And I think there's a kind of interesting what if. What if Bava had made Barbarella and Roger Vadim had made this film? And I think each of them could have made the other one's film.
Yeah.
I'd love to see Bava's Barbarella, and Vadim's Diabolic probably would have been interesting as well. But yeah, it's that kind of kinkiness that sort of sets it apart from Batman.
Yeah.
I think that thing about them, they're both sort of tongue in cheek takes on the character, and of course, more recently we have the much more serious Batman movies. Now we have the sort of the Dark Knight Batman, and the even darker Knight, which seems to be the new Batman. And we have a new Diabolic film as well, which came out at the end of last year. Which I think sort of fans of the comic have probably been, because I suspect I think there's a slight parallel between the way the 60s Batman series for a long time, I think, rubbed some Batman fans up the wrong way.
Yeah.
Because it was tongue in cheek and it was camp. No, we want a serious Batman. I think there were some Diabolic fans who felt the same way about Bava's film. This is not quite the Diabolic that we want. And I mean, I've not seen the new one yet, but I've read the novelization. I've read a lot about it. It certainly sounds a lot more faithful to the comic than the Bava version is. The Bava sort of, and I think De Laurentiis as well. They kind of come up with their own version of the character.
Yeah.
He's more, and he's almost a kind of countercultural figure in the film as well. He blows up the tax office. He's sort of up against the government, and it's almost, the location. It's almost as though it's kind of like a police state. You've got these, the police are in these kind of quasi-military outfits.
It's interesting you should say that. I got some their Fahrenheit 451 vibes from at the start. So the officers on their sort of motorbikes and all
Yeah.
it did feel quite a bit like that. I did get that
Yes.
that sort of vibe from it, but it exists in a world that isn't quite our own, as it were. I think that's the
And it's never clear. Where is it set? Is it Italy? Is it America? Is it somewhere in Europe?
Well, Terry Thomas turns up, so it could even
Yes, it could be anywhere.
which is a nice one. But I think for me as well, I think the cast is really great, and it's got John Philip Law. Okay, doesn't perhaps have to do too much acting wise, but his eyebrow acting or his eye acting is certainly very good indeed.
Yeah, he always claims that's how he got the role. Was he met with Bava and he did lots of things with his eyebrow. And I think as long as if you can do Diabolic's eyebrow, you can play the part.
Yeah,
because it's not an acting part really. No. Diabolic, he's an iconic character. I mean, in the comic, he has exactly two character traits. In the comic, he loves Ava, and he likes stealing things.
Yeah,
and that's him. That's the full extent of his personality.
Yeah. And to be fair, it doesn't go much sort of further than that in the film version either.
No, it doesn't.
I think for me, two sort of standouts. Michelle, they sort of Piccoli as Inspector. They're sort of
Jinko, yeah,
and again something very they're sort of Italian. In this is their sort of portrayal of the their sort of police. So, and he is very much in that it's almost, I don't want to call it a comedy sort of role, but they're always a bit haphazard or they're always one step they're behind.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, Jinko is he's a character who, and also in the comic, they have to pull off this really difficult sort of tightrope thing with him, that he has to look like a good, competent, efficient police officer, but at the same time, he must obviously never ever catch Diabolic.
yeah, exactly. So I think he does that well. I think obviously fans of sort of Western, I say Western, obviously they're Italian, is their Western cinema, but someone else who there stands out is obviously Adolfo Vercelli as Ralph Valmont. Obviously we know him best from their Thunderball, but he does have some sort of Bond-esque moments in this one as well, doesn't he? So.
Yes, he's got his sort of super yacht that he's on, which is a bit like the Disco Volante in Thunderball. Thunderball seems to have been the Bond film that had a particular impact in Italy, and actually the comic of Diabolic was always sort of taking things from Thunderball, jetpacks and the underwater stuff seemed to sort of have an impact. It was always doing sort of underwater action. And obviously the film does seem to have one eye on the Bond films. It's got the same kind of glamour and the gadgetry and so on.
Yeah. Again, an iconic their sort of car. So obviously we have the Jaguar in this one. I do wonder. I hope it was just a shell that got pushed over the mountainside at the start of the film, because I was like, "Oh, that's a lovely car just to be."
Yeah. I mean the E-Type Jaguar is very much the Aston Martin of Diabolic.
Yeah.
It's always been his signature car. And also, sort of the rather nice idea of Ava having a white Jaguar to kind of complement it.
Yeah, and again, there's some good set sort of pieces. So we've obviously touched on the sort of underwater their sequence, which looks great.
Yes,
I think it really does. And then there's the train their sequence as well, which is only slightly let down by there's one shot which is quite obviously a tiny model.
Yes.
But I think it's about the only one that actually looks like that. I think almost everything else in the film
but to be honest, even some of the bigger budgeted films from that period, there'll occasionally be an effect which doesn't quite, match the rest of the film.
Yeah.
I don't. Every time in the '60s Bond films, someone goes off a cliff or a mountain, their knees bend the wrong way before they hit the ground below.
Yeah. No, thankfully, no sort of Fulci-esque they're falling off their cliff their
No.
tops either. So it was quite nice. So I th- I think as well for me, I think one of the highlights and probably the thing that actually makes the film is their music.
Yes.
And I suppose it's quite favourable that he gets, probably the most well-known their Italian film, their sort of composer to actually do the music for this one.
Yeah. Yeah. It's far and away the best music score on any of Bava's films. I mean, it's a real shame he didn't get to work with Morricone more.
Mm-hmm.
He worked with some other good composers. Piero Umiliani on $5 for an August Moon.
Mm-hmm.
That's also a very nice score. But yeah, Diabolic is the standout.
Yeah.
The standout soundtrack, really.
Yeah. And if you don't know, I mean, if you're listening there to this and you don't know this film, then why on earth are you listening to this and not going off and actually watching it? But the music itself, it is so good, and it's a proper earworm as well. So I know for the rest of the day I'm actually going to be, they're sort of humming there quite a few bits from the score because it just sticks with you. As a little aside there, Leonard, just to kind of round this bit up now. De Laurentiis is a film they're making now. Obviously, this sort of Barbarella. He did this comic book adaptation. Now, I'm wondering at the time. I think he probably already purchased the rights to Flash. Gordon. I know that he did. He picked him up fairly early. I know that George Lucas wanted actually to make Flash Gordon, and he didn't get a chance because he had the rights. Now he didn't get to make his version of obviously until after Star Wars had been a big hit. But I do wonder about a 1960s version. Could we have had a Bava-esque version of?
Yeah, I think in many ways it's a shame because I always kind of think of those three films as like a kind of delayed trilogy. Flash Gordon certainly seems to kind of follow on from those two films. And in some ways, one of the things that's slightly endearing about Flash Gordon is the special effects in some ways almost look as though they were made immediately after Barbarella. They certainly don't look like the kinds of effects that Star Wars brought into movies. They, it's part of the charm of the film that the effects slightly lag behind some of the other aspects of the film. Yeah, sort of a Bava Flash Gordon. I mean, there was a lot of talk in the 60s about doing Flash Gordon because there was an earlier abortive attempt to do Diabolic from a producer called Tonino Cervi, who actually started shooting a version with Seth Holt. Mm-hmm. Seth Holt started directing a version with Jean Sorel and Elsa Martinelli, and then it ran into problems. Depending on who you believe, either because they ran out of money or because Seth Holt's drinking was sort of causing problems with the shooting. But at the time, Tonino Cervi said the one he really wanted to do was Flash Gordon. But they knew it would be an expensive film. I think it was obviously going to be, and probably more expensive even than Barbarella.
Yeah. But we can, but wonder about a 1960s Italian version. But
it would have been glorious.
It would have been. Just as a side note, Leon, now my listeners know this. You probably don't know this, but Flash Gordon's my all-time favourite film. So I absolutely love it there to bits.
Yeah, I'm very, very fond of Flash Gordon.
Yeah, I do. I absolutely love it. Now, obviously, if we're talking Mario Bava, Leon, we'll have to talk horror, giallo. We can't get away from that.
Yeah.
So for our final film, and we are going to, talk about one of his slightly later entries, and funnily enough, we've spoke about, two films so far, which in their own way sum up the 1960s. And for me, when I was watching this and watching it again there recently, and I was quite struck by this one comes out in 1970 that we're going to talk about. For me, it feels very different, and it
Yeah.
starts to feel very 1970s. It has a very different feel about it. So we are talking about Hatchet for the honeymoon. Now, I would imagine it was probably made in their 69.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was made between 68 and 69. They
Uh-huh.
submitted it to the censor board at the end of 69, but then there was a bit of a delay in it coming out.
Uh-huh.
And Five Dollars for an August Moon, which was actually two films on from
Mm-hmm.
Hatchet for Honeymoon, actually came out first. So it was delayed a little bit in Italy. It took 3 years to come out over here.
Yeah.
It was released in the UK in 1973 under the title Blood Brides. It was shown. It was released on the double bill with The Creeping Flesh. So yeah, it's sort of it is very different from the others, and I think it sort of stands out from Bava's other gialli or thrillers,
Uh-huh.
whatever we want to call them. Because he sort of made those two '60s ones. There's The Girl Who Knew Too Much and the Blood and Black Lace, which are
Mm-hmm.
seen as like the kind of the formative Italian thrillers, which between them seem to be doing most of the things that Dario Argento would do in the '70s.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the early '70s, you have $5 for an August Moon and Bay of Blood.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about films with lots of titles. That's got more than almost any other Bava film I can think of. And in many ways, those are two films that are almost telling the same story, but in a slightly different way. They've both got high body counts, and they're about sort of grasping, greedy characters. And then in the middle, we've got this one, which is a sort of unusual mixture of things because it starts off as though it's a giallo. And if we've seen Blood and Black Lace, we think, okay, we're in a fashion house again. We've got mannequins again. We've got a killer. Obviously, there's no mystery about who. It's no spoiler to say who the killer is it? Because it tells us pretty much in the opening scene who the killer is. So the mystery is, why is he killing? He's killing because there is a secret he's trying to unlock. So he's sort of the killer and the detective at the same time. He's like a kind of detective of his own psyche, because bits of the memory come back with each. He sort of kills women on the eve of their wedding, and that brings back a bit more of the memory. It's a kind of slightly Sergio Leone type thing of like the memory coming back bit by bit. But then at a certain point, it also turns into a ghost story.
Yeah.
Because he murders his wife, who's played by Laura Betti, who's a very classy person for Bava to get in one of his films.
Yeah.
And apparently she approached him. She wanted to work with Bava, and she'd turn up again in Bay of Blood. She was associated with Pasolini.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was looking through their credits, and it's like the La Dolce Vita, the 1900, which is a favourite of mine, which I love. A real epic film.
Yeah, and Theorem she was in for Pasolini.
Yeah, and then she turns up in these, and it's like,
yeah,
okay.
yeah. And as I say, apparently she approached him. This is one of the strange paradoxes about Bava, is there's some evidence that sort of intellectuals and aesthetically minded people liked his films. Actually probably more than film critics did, and probably more than audiences did. There was something in those films that they responded to, and she apparently wanted to work with him. and I think she's one of the best things about the film. I think she's
probably the
terrific in it.
best thing about the film.
Yes.
To be honest,
Yeah.
yeah. It is a nice. I wouldn't. It's not. It's like we said. It's not a sort of twist as such because we know who the killer is. But like for me, when I'm watching it, I almost got a. There's almost a sort of Sixth Sense vibe about it, or is the main character? Is he going mad? You know, is it more of a psychological sort of twist, or is it an actual supernatural one?
Yeah,
Yeah,
it lends itself to that uncertainty because one of the things I like about the ghost story aspect of it is this sort of wonderful take on the ghost that everybody can see the ghost except the person she's actually haunting.
yeah,
So he can't actually see her, but everybody else can, or so it seems. They keep
yeah.
saying, "Oh, your wife's looking well today."
Yeah.
Dumped her in the river yesterday, didn't I? But of course, yeah, as you say, I mean, he tells us in a voiceover at the start of the film. He says, "I'm completely mad. I'm a paranoiac." And that's he sort of seems quite pleased with himself,
Yeah.
and he's sort of trying to sort of trace the root of his madness. The Italian title of the film is Il Rosso Segno della Follia, the red sign of madness. So that sort of seems to push it towards a kind of it's a psychological thriller.
Yeah. Uh-huh. But yeah, it's a nice, like we say, it's a nice sort of change to the film, or one that lets you hold your their sort of attention, because I think probably that the so we know that the John Harrington this character, he is the killer, so we don't have that aspect of it. To be honest, it's probably not that difficult to work out after a short while why he's doing the killings.
No, there's obviously a kind of psycho-like mother obsession
Yeah,
sort of going on in the film, and we
Yeah.
have a séance where his wife is doing the voice of the mother, and yeah, I think we figured it out before he has.
yeah,
But there's also that kind of interest. The other curious thing about the film is that this is the way that he's kind of being haunted by two ghosts, because there's the ghost of his wife in the second half of the film after he murders her, but there's also the figure of the little boy who we maybe initially don't quite know who he is. Again, this is probably a bit more of a spoiler. That the boy is, he's kind of haunted by his childhood self.
yeah,
So there's this curious sense that sometimes he's watching the boy, as in that very strange sequence on the train at the beginning,
yeah.
a very sort of disorienting sequence where we don't quite know where we are, what's going on, who is this boy, is the boy actually on the train corridor, what's going on with that. The boy appears at various points in the film. The boy is the last thing we see in the film, and those, I think, are some of the most interesting things about the film. I think maybe as a giallo, it's not terribly interesting as a giallo.
Mm-hmm.
Because as you say, the mystery's pretty easy to work out. Whenever the detective turns up, the film seems to sort of grind to a halt a little bit, and we sort of get these slightly uninspiring scenes where there's lots of sort of zooming in and out, and even Bava doesn't seem to be very interested in those parts of the film.
Yeah.
But once we're back in the psyche of the character, and we've got the ghosts, and we've got the stuff with the boy, it's such a curious film. It's a very odd film.
I think for me the kills themselves as well. I got a lovely set. I don't know if lovely is the right word. Actually, lovely isn't the right word, because we are talking about young women there getting murdered here. But there's a say. I think they're like there's a couple of scenes in these dancing around with the bride around his like their sort of mansion, and sweeping them up, and a sense of a sense of joy from the female their sort of characters, and even though you know he's going to kill them, it's almost like, oh no, don't, you don't want, you don't want to know what's going to happen. You know it's going to happen, but certainly for me, it's they created great sort of tension, even though you knew they were going to get murdered. But
Yes.
That worked really well.
Yeah. It's also, considering he is a kind of serial killer, it's not a particularly graphic film. It's not one of the more sort of violent, gory Bava films.
Yeah.
And I think again that sort of pushes it more towards, whether we interpret it as a psychological thriller or a ghost story, it pushes it more towards that. It doesn't have the same, the murders aren't the kind of shocking sequences that we have in Blood and Black Lace or Bay of Blood.
It's interesting because and in one of the earlier ones, and I think it's the first murder that we do see, and it gets a little bit this sort of voyeuristic, or a little bit sort of kinky in a way, and I was like, where's this going? And then actually it pulls back from that.
Yeah.
And like you say, it's not very, very sort of graphic or sort of voyeuristic or they're sort of misogynistic either, which you can often get in these films.
I mean, some of that reticence, I wonder if it was partly because it was a Spanish-Italian co-production and a majority Spanish production, and Spanish censorship, I think, was a bit stricter than Italian censorship in the 70s. That might have been one of the reasons. But then Bava's, sometimes people think of Bava as, a pioneer of the kind of violence that we associate with Argento and Fulci. But it was never really a consistent part of Bava's films. Some of his films are, they're still pretty shocking.
Yeah.
But it's not something that's a presence in all of his films by any means. Some of them sort of go more for atmosphere and more for suggestion as well.
Yeah, definitely. And it's something that he uses so well. And certainly watching this one, it does work. It does work really well. And it's a satisfying film, isn't it? I think you get a sense of, For you, Leon, how does in the ranks of sort of Bava's horror or his giallo films, where does this one lie for you? Is this near the top of the pile, or?
I think this one's a really tricky one to place. I think it's kind of a grower amongst Bava's films. It's obviously, I think it's one that sometimes gets forgotten about. I think it's a little uneven in some respects. I think it's one of those Bava films where you can tell which bits of the film he was interested in and which bits he was probably a little bit less interested in. So I can kind of see why it's one that tends not to end up in people's sort of top five. I mean, I certainly wouldn't put it in a kind of Bava top five, although my Bava top five would probably be different from one day to the next. So maybe it sort of sits somewhere in the middle. I think it's interesting because it was the first film he made after he did a couple of things with De Laurentiis. He did Diabolic, and then he did an episode of the TV series The Odyssey, where he did the episode featuring Polyphemus, the Cyclops. So it was almost like a return to the peplum. And actually, that's one of the best things I think he ever did. And then I think he decided, sort of mainstream big budget or comparatively big budget wasn't quite for him. And his films sort of start to change direction a little bit. As I say, they sometimes become a little bit more uneven because I think the budgets get lower. Some of them start to have problems getting released. As I say, this one, there was a bit of a delay in it coming out. The next film he did was 4 Times That Night, sex comedy, which took about 3 or 4 years to come out. Lisa and the Devil never really got picked up for distribution in Italy or in English-speaking territories, and has to become House of Exorcism, Rabid Dogs, Cani Arrabbiati, his sort of kidnapping film, that didn't come out. I mean, that never came out in cinemas, and many years after his death, sort of got restored and came out in different versions. So it sort of enters a more kind of difficult period for him, I think, and also a period where he sometimes, because I think he's a bit of a one-man band on this film. He's doing his own photography again. He's working a bit more with what he can get. So I think it sort of probably sits somewhere in the middle.
Maybe maybe shows, like I said, maybe if not the peak. I mean, certainly the Bay of Blood's a fantastic film, which obviously he made after this, but it's maybe it does show that the 70s are coming in. There is a change there, a change for him.
I think there was already a change in the mid '60s. Yeah, the industry was changing. Some of his regular collaborators were going on to other things. He was starting to, by the end of this, he was starting to work more with his son. Lamberto was sort of becoming his assistant, and they'd end up virtually, and in fact, literally co-directors towards the end of Bava's career. He wasn't necessarily always getting the projects that were quite so suited to his talents. So you get, Westerns, for example, weren't necessarily quite so much his thing. He does 3 Westerns. He did a Franco and Ciccio comedy, which I think is a lot of fun in its way, but it's a bit like, directing a carry-on film. There's only so much you can do, really. You get it done, and it is what it is.
Yeah.
And then, he was getting older. I think his health was not so great towards the end of his career. And I say that the films are sometimes a bit. They're always interesting. I don't think there's one single Bava film that is of no interest whatsoever. But I think there is a period of unevenness.
Yeah.
And then, and also things like I think the budgets get lower, the schedules get shorter. There's a lot more use of the zoom lens. I think this film makes a lot more use of the zoom lens than it does of sort of some of the fluid tracking shots that you get in some of the earlier films.
Yeah. And I think you're right. I think this possibly is it's a sign of the times. Definitely, I think we definitely see that. I think as well, maybe just to kind of round off as well. I mean, we speak about a lot of the difficulties that he did have later on. I think it's actually no testament there to the man himself that his last film, The Shock, has just had a lovely Blu-ray there released for for the world there to see. So even and I must admit that's a very uneven film. It's not a great one by any means, or at least not in my eyes anyway. And but it's nice to know it's been brought out there again for us to see, and hopefully there's a bit of sort of glory that we can see in it.
Yes, yeah, and that is, nearly as much a Lamberto Bava film as it is a Mario Bava film. I think the baton was being passed to a certain extent with that, and he did one more thing after that, which was a TV production, La Venere Dio, where Lamberto is actually credited as co-director.
Yeah.
Actually, it would be nice to see a Blu-ray of that. That's considering it's made for TV, is actually pretty good.
Yeah.
and would be worth bringing out.
Mm-hmm. I think his son certainly. It's very interesting, and I mean, we were talking just at the start, actually, before we were talking about the Argento. Now, it's quite obvious to me how much the Bava influenced him, and the Bava's son actually got a chance to make some of the great films under under working alongside the Argento as well.
Yeah.
There for the 1980s, and very much. I mean, the Demons is such an amazingly well sort of crafted film. I'm sure there's.
Yeah,
I'm sure
Demons is interesting in terms of sort of, it's got Bava genes in it and it's got Argento genes in
uh-huh.
it as
Yeah.
well. Obviously, like The Mask puts you in mind of Black Sunday, but it's the other things about it sort of push it more towards Argento. And
Yeah.
obviously, Argento had a lot of input into that film.
But I think he was Bava's son. Finding his own way and making a very technically accomplished film. They're a great looking film, a very 80s film.
Yeah.
I suppose going on and actually keeping the name alive, and they're creating another great set of films that that we all love, or we can um, they sort of appreciate. Certainly, I mean, there's lots to like in those films as well. So
Yeah, Demons is a lot of fun, I think.
yeah, yeah, and so is the Demons too, and but yeah, definitely. So there, Liam, thanks so much. This has been a fascinating chat, and I think as well nice to talk about Bava in a bit more of a wide sort of sense as well. I mean, looking at three very different films, for him. So I think there's something for everyone in there, definitely. And for you, Leon, where can we find the book? Where is that available?
Well, it's available on Amazon. I mean, either on obviously Bloomsbury with the publisher, it's
Mm-hmm.
available on their website. I do feel like I sort of need to say something just to address the elephant in the room. It's a very expensive elephant in the room, which is the price of it. Because I'm picturing somebody. All right, off to Amazon, and how much? So yes, it is probably you will find it's rather more expensive than you might be expecting it to be, and that's because there is a practice because it's under an academic imprint, and a practice that academic publishers don't always but do sometimes use is to initially kind of test the water with a book by bringing out at a price that's aimed at libraries.
Yeah.
So initially they see the main market for it as libraries, and then if it does reasonably well, then fingers crossed we can get it into an affordable paperback. So I'm not necessarily expecting many people to pay. I don't. I'm ashamed to even say what the price of the book is, but I'm not expecting people to pay that. But do please encourage your library to order it, because if libraries order it in, it means you can get to read it, and it also means that somewhere down the line there should be an affordable paperback, which if you enjoy reading in the library, you can actually then get your own copy of it.
So indeed, Leon. So thank you very much. If the Bloomsbury are listening, I'm actually off down my local library right now to they order a copy of it in. It is available in an ebook as well, isn't it, Liam?
Yeah, there is, but
Yeah.
frankly, that isn't much cheaper than the hardback, to be honest. I should probably also actually just say what the title of the book is, which I don't think I have. The full title of the book is Mario Bava, the Artisan as Italian Horror Auteur. That's the full title
Yeah.
of the book,
Yeah.
just for library ordering purposes.
There, if I get a ISBN number, I'll stick that up as well somewhere.
Yeah, I'll send those details to you so you can put it on the website. Yeah.
So everyone can actually go off and then they'd order it through your library, so we can all
Yes.
get a chance to read it. But thanks so much, Elliot. It's been
Well, thank you very much
brilliant.
for inviting me on.
Welcome. I'll absolutely have you back to talk about more their Bava, or indeed anything you would like to talk about, because it's been absolutely brilliant. So once again, thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening.